In today's video, we will be going over how to calculate revocable time for probation violation guidelines. Revocable time is a common factor across the no new law misdemeanor, and new law felony worksheets located at the top of each sheet. Revocable time is the amount of time the defendant could serve if they are found guilty of the violation, or another way to look at it is how much time is hanging over their head. It is the sum of all the suspended time for each underlying offense in the probation violation sentencing event. You can also find this information on page 52 in your probation violation guidelines manual. Let's look at some examples of what revocable time would look like. First, we will look at revocable time for one offense in the revocation event. This defendant was sentenced for forging banknotes with 10 years imposed and all 10 years suspended. So by using our definition of the total amount of suspended time, the revocable time in this case is 10 years. In our second example, the defendant was convicted of statutory burglary with 20 years imposed and 8 years suspended, so the total revocable time is 8 years. In our last example, the defendant was convicted of possession of a Schedule 1-2 drug with 5 years imposed and sentenced to time served. The revocable time for this event is 5 years minus the amount of time they served in jail prior to the conviction. This is very different than credit for time served. You would only use time served for revocable time if the judge sentenced the defendant to time served. You should be able to obtain this data through the jail where they were held or through LIDS. Now let's go over the total revocable time for individuals who are on probation for multiple offenses. In this first example, the defendant was convicted of carjacking with 50 years imposed, 30 years suspended, and also convicted of malicious wounding with 15 years imposed and 8 years suspended. Remember, revocable time is the sum of the suspended time for each underlying offense, so we would calculate this as the 30 years suspended for the carjacking plus the 8 years suspended for the malicious wounding, with a total revocable time of 38 years. Next, we have an individual who was convicted of grand larceny with 20 years imposed, 17 years suspended, and an assault on a law enforcement officer with 5 years imposed and 4 years and 6 months suspended, with the mandatory time of serving 6 months for the assault. When we add up the suspended time, we get a total revocable time of 21 years and 6 months. In our last example, we have a defendant with 3 convictions. We add up the 3 years and 6 months suspended for the DUI, 5 years for the eluding since 5 years were imposed with all suspended, and then the 6 years for the involuntary manslaughter for a total revocable time of 14 years and 6 months. So we have our base for calculating the revocable time, and the previous examples will always apply if your client is appearing for their first revocation hearing. But what happens to the total revocable time after one or multiple probation revocations? Let's take a look. Whenever you have a probation revocation, the revocable time becomes the amount of resuspended time for the offense or offenses after each revocation hearing. If the same amount of time is imposed and suspended for the revocation, the amount of revocable time stays the same. However, if the judge imposes any time to serve on one or more of the offenses in the revocation event, the total revocable time will change. Lastly, if the defendant receives a new conviction and is subsequently placed on probation, it is a new underlying offense, and the suspended time for the new conviction is added on to the total revocable time. Let's look at some examples of each of these scenarios. First, we will look at what a revocation would look like with no time imposed on the violation. We will use our previous example of the defendant who was convicted of grand larceny and assault on law enforcement. After he served his time, his total revocable time was 21 years and 6 months. When he appears for his revocation hearing, you will see that he has the revocable time for each offense hanging over his head since he already served the total 3 years and 6 months. At this revocation hearing, the judge imposed and suspended all of the time for both offenses, so the revocable time remains 21 years and 6 months. However, what would this look like if the judge imposed time to serve for the violation? Using the same example, we have our original sentencing with 21 years and 6 months revocable time. You'll see at the revocation hearing that it's still the 17 years imposed for the grand larceny and 4 years and 6 months imposed for the assault on law enforcement, but in this case, the judge found the defendant in violation and imposed 1 year to serve on the larceny with 16 years suspended, and then 2 years and 6 months to serve for the assault with 2 years suspended, making the new revocable time 18 years. What happens to revocable time if there are multiple revocation events? Using our example of the individual with the grand larceny and assault convictions, we have our original sentencing, the previous revocation hearing where he had the time imposed, and then he decides to violate again and has another revocation hearing. You'll see that we have the suspended time for each of the charges from the last violation hanging over his head since he already served his 3 years and 6 months for those. And the judge imposed the 16 years for the grand larceny with 13 years suspended, and then the 2 years imposed with all resuspended for the assault, resulting in a new revocable time of 15 years. Just to emphasize, when you are calculating the revocable time, you are not adding up the total suspended time for each sentencing and revocation. The revocable time resets after each revocation hearing, so you do not include the suspended time for each revocation event. The revocable time is the amount of suspended time after the most recent revocation hearing. So when looking at this example, we would not include the original revocable time in our sentencing event, nor the revocable time for the first revocation. We would only add up the suspended time for the most recent revocation hearing, again getting our total of 15 years. Now, let's look at an example of a revocation resulting from a new conviction. We will use the most recent revocation for our defendant, where he now has 15 years of revocable time hanging over his head after serving time for his original sentencing and then the prior violations. After serving his 3 years on the last violation, he obtained a new conviction of indecent liberties with a child less than 15 years old. The judge imposed 10 years with 5 years suspended. This new conviction obviously violates his current probation obligation, so the defendant appears before the judge and is given another year to serve on the grand larceny conviction and has the full 2 years for the assault suspended again. From the revocation on the original underlying offenses, he now has 14 years hanging over his head, but then he also has the suspended time for the new conviction. Just like the other probation revocations, we will add up the suspended time from the probation revocation hearing, but will now also add the suspended time for the new conviction, 5 years, which results in a new revocable time of 19 years. 12 years suspended for the larceny, 2 years suspended for the assault, and then the new 5 years suspended for the indecent liberties. Now let's look at a different case that involves both multiple revocations and a new conviction. This format might be a bit more familiar to you as well for those of you who complete pre-sentence investigations. So we have a defendant who was sentenced in 2010 for aggravated sexual battery and was given 20 years with 10 years suspended, so the total revocable time at this point is 10 years. He serves his time, and then upon release he receives a new conviction for failing to register as a sex offender. He receives 5 years with 30 days to serve, or 4 years 11 months suspended. This conviction violates his original probation obligation, and he is given 10 years imposed with 9 years suspended. The revocable time at this point is 9 years for the original offense, and then 4 years 11 months for the new offense, with a total of 13 years and 11 months revocable time. Remember, the suspended time resets after each revocation, so we do not include the suspended time in the original sentence toward our revocable time. And then, after he serves his 1 year for the first violation, he violates again and receives 9 years suspended for the sexual battery charge, and then 4 years 11 months imposed with 60 days to serve for the failure to register, so 4 years and 9 months suspended. We cancel out the previous time imposed and suspended for the first violation, so our revocable time is now 9 years for the sexual battery and 4 years 9 months for the failure to register, resulting in a total revocable time of 13 years and 9 months. There are multiple ways you can calculate the revocable time. So far, we have been adding up the suspended time left after each revocation hearing, but it might be easier for you to subtract the amount of time served from each violation. Let's go back to our example of the individual with the grand larceny and assault on law enforcement convictions. After his original sentencing, he had 21 years and 6 months revocable time. At his first revocation, he had to serve 3 years and 6 months, so we can subtract that. Then at the next revocation hearing, he had to serve another 3 years, so we can subtract those years as well. But then he received the new conviction, so we actually do have to add that suspended time, but then we subtract the 1 year served at the last revocation hearing for that new conviction. And that results in the same 19 years revocable time after the 3 revocation hearings and the new conviction. And now just a couple final reminders regarding revocable time. Remember, you compute the revocable time for convictions and probation violations in your court only. Do not include suspended time from convictions in outside jurisdictions as revocable time for your court. New convictions for outside jurisdictions are a factor for probation violation guidelines, but not for revocable time. Next, when calculating revocable time, remember that it is the sum of all the suspended time for each underlying offense in the probation revocation event, not just the revocable time for your primary offense. And lastly, remember that when calculating revocable time, it resets after each revocation hearing, so you do not add up the suspended time from the original sentencing and the previous revocation events. We hope this video was helpful to you. If you have any questions, please call our hotline at 804-225-4398, text us at 804-393-9588, or email us at swift@vacourts.gov. Thank you for watching and have a great day.